And the other kind, which are the more majority of the settlers, are in fact ordinary Israelis who came there simply because the government was offering them very cheap housing. When you go to live there, then most of the money you get is a government loan, and if you stay there for 10 years, then you don't have to pay back the loan.
Well, I think the unpleasant and unavoidable comparison is with South Africa during the apartheid period. And I must say that, having visited South Africa, that they were much better off than the Palestinians living in the refugee camps.
We went to jail because it was impossible to sit still while the obscenity of the apartheid system was being imposed on our people.
The United States is seen quite correctly as being the sole supporter of Israel, and that Israel would not be able to do what it is doing without American green light.
The U.S.-Israeli relationship is really unique on Capitol Hill. In my 22 years that I served there was never a moment when there was really a debate about U.S. policy in the Middle East. It was always, what does Israel want? And almost always, Congress gave them exactly what they wanted without any debate, without any amendments being considered. This tied policy exists as a result of a number of factors. First of all, there is the lobby, the U.S. lobby for Israel, AIPAC, American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee. It has a multi-million-dollar budget. It has a highly professional group of people working on Capitol Hill. They know the legislative process, they know the personalities, and therefore advance what's best for the state of Israel.
Congress seems to think that if you oppose what Israel wants, you'll be defeated in the next election.
Another factor is the fundamentalist Christian community. Fundamentalists are often represented by the televangelists that are on TV. They believe that a strong Israel is a part of God's plan. They believe that the day will come when a battle will occur in the plain of Armageddon in the Middle East. There will be the forces of truth and righteousness on one side, the force of evil on the other side. And in that struggle, the Christian forces, led by the second coming of Jesus Christ, will prevail. All of the Jews will be either destroyed or converted instantly to Christianity. It may sound to the viewer as a very far-out notion, but believe me, it is widely held and supported by millions of Americans whose doctrines really, in the ultimate, are hostile to the survival of Jews, but nevertheless The supporters of Israel see this vast body of American people as being a great asset at this time, so they embrace him.
And Mr. Robertson, who said, I had a vision from God that we have to support Israel. And no matter what happens and what they do, this is the will of God because they're God's chosen people. A couple of weeks later, he added, and that's when this ministry started really being blessed, when we made that commitment to Israel. Not the commitment to God or Jesus Christ's teachings, but to Israel.
And we have come from all the nations of the earth to say to the people of Israel, we are your friends, we are with you, and we believe that you are called by God to possess this land.
I, as a Christian and a Christian pastor, object, not in my name, and not in the name of over 115 to 120 million Christians, do you dare say that we support injustice and deceit. We do not.
The citizenry of this democratic society is systematically deprived of access to the real facts.
The American media play a major role in continuing U.S. support for Israel through leaving out vast swaths of information. It is the classic case of lying through omission. Major statements by American diplomats, senators, military leaders are going unreported. Sentences are being removed from news stories. Information is being manipulated.
Those are the three factors that work together on Capitol Hill and lead to such total bias, such total absence of free speech, of open debate that is, I think, very destructive to our institutions and to our best interests in world affairs.
So Israel, for example, does not abide at all by international law. The entire occupation is illegal. It's a violation in particular of the Fourth Geneva Convention. By the rules of the Fourth Geneva Convention, you're not allowed to build settlements, you're not allowed to build roads, you're not allowed to expropriate land, you're not allowed to deport people, you're not allowed to restrict their freedom of movement, you're not allowed to harm their economy, you're not allowed to make them unemployed and impoverished.
Everything that Israel does in the occupied territories, U.S. taxpayers are paying for it. The U.S. gives the financing, it gives the military support.
Israel receives as much foreign economic assistance as all the countries combined in the world.
In March 2003, the U.S. government approved $10 billion in aid for Israel. At the same time, it withheld a $3.5 billion grant to upgrade the training of first responders, those who would be first to respond to a terrorist attack. Spent domestically, that $10 billion could buy health care coverage for over 4 million children without proper coverage, or pay for 1.5 million American children to attend Head Start child development programs to prepare them for school, or simply help states offset the costs of one of the worst fiscal crises in half a century.
one of the reasons that the American commitment to Israel is so strong, that it's not only reflecting the impact of well-organized pro-Israeli lobbies, but it also represents the views of the Pentagon that sees Israel now as an indispensable strategic ally in the effort to control and exert influence throughout the region.
The main concern for the United States, like the world, is the oil-producing regions. And in order to control that, you need a way of doing it.
Desperate for a peace that would finally end occupation, Palestinians again came to the negotiating table in 2000.
People think, look, Israel was very forthcoming. It offered 95% of the West Bank, of the occupied territories to the Palestinians, and they rejected it in violence. The assumption of that 95% argument is that getting 95% of the land gives you 95% sovereignty, a sovereign country. But I think it's very useful to think in terms of a prison. If you look at a blueprint of a prison, it looks like the prisoners own the place. And the prisoners have 95% of the area. They've got the living areas, they have the exercise yard, they have the cafeteria, they've got the work areas. All the prison authorities have is 5%, is the control.
The average Palestinian didn't think they were throwing anything away because there was nothing to throw away. They had tuned out what Barak and Arafat were talking about, because on the ground there were ongoing land expropriations, tree uprootings, road building, unfair water allocation, leaving many Palestinian families in the summer and fall with 2 hours of running water a week, when next door you have a settlement with a swimming pool and green lawns. So what do you expect people to think?
And it was that pressure, that sense of being squeezed, that finally exploded in September of 2000 in what became the Second Intifada.
Called the Second Intifada is essentially a mobilization of resistance against this structure of occupation and oppression. Israel, from the very beginning of these demonstrations, had indeed relied on excessive force. They had used live ammunition against unarmed demonstrators, had inflicted several deaths, and hundreds of casualties in the opening days of the Intifada.
Sometimes the Israelis are speaking about rubber bullets they used. By the way, it's not rubber, it's steel coated with rubber. This bullet, it killed many of the kids who are demonstrating, sometimes while they are throwing stones. As this case, I'll show you what happened. He is a 14 years old from Khan Younis. He was shot with a one like this and entered here, and he died.
A lot of the deaths have been children, and we do have some documentary evidence that security forces are firing on crowds of children.
The soldiers weren't at risk. They're heavily armored, they have all this high-powered weaponry, and no child with a stone is going to be a risk to them.
Most of the Palestinian abuses involve shooting at settlements, ambushes on settler cars, and obviously the suicide bombings inside Israel.
There are some risks to Israeli life. Many Israelis have been killed.
When there was this horrible suicide bombing at the pizza place in Jerusalem, I went to visit some of the kids who survived that blast in the hospital. It was horrible. It was horrible to see what happened to these children.
You see the blood, you see the agony of the family. This is what the world sees. But one cannot take it out of the general context. And the context is of an Israeli occupation which is, it seems not to be so brutal, but it's very brutal. It really makes people's lives unbearable.
The use of suicide bombers is an act of desperation. It's the weapons of the weak.
Israel doesn't do it, never, because it has airplanes and helicopters. Why should they send anybody to make suicide?
I think we have to change our conception of what Israel is. Israel likes to present itself as this little country surrounded by a sea of hostile Arabs, and we just want peace, and they're violent. Israel is the 5th largest nuclear power in the world. It's got between 200 and 300 nuclear warheads. So the reality is that Israel is a regional superpower.
For the first time, the resistance to that occupation had, to a very small extent, an armed component. There was nothing close to equal force.
At every stage, they had used grossly excessive force against a completely defenseless civilian population.
The victims have been overwhelmingly Palestinian civilians, overwhelmingly, not armed groups or armed individuals.
Israel has established all of these checkpoints within the West Bank, which require Palestinians to wait hours and hours to go very short distances.
Just the freedom of movement, it's something that Palestinians are denied on a daily basis. The access to Jerusalem, the access to health care, the access to hospitals, clinics, and schools.
We're talking about 3 million people who's had their freedom of movement totally stopped. It's a violation of international law. That the right to freedom of movement is a fundamental right in the Declaration of Human Rights. What you have is young Israeli conscripts who look bored. These guys are sitting out there and they're watching thousands of Palestinians go by. They have carte blanche to pull anyone over and harass them for whatever reason. They can detain them for hours, and it's a dangerous situation.
The main population that are being affected by Israeli policies is the civilian population. Those population who is not being involved in any attacks against Israelis, civilians or the army.
During this time of closure, unfortunately, there have been lots of bombings, lots of attacks. The closure is not meant to deter suicide bombers. It's meant to punish and put pressure on 3 million civilians.
People do not earn anymore because the majority of the Palestinians used to work in Israel, and the majority of the Palestinian economy was based on the income of people who were working inside Israel. Now they cannot go into Israel, so tens of thousands of families just lose the source of income that they had. The education system is also affected by that. The student cannot go to the university.
Birzeit University was subject to army closures for something like 18 times. The longest closure was during the first Intifada. For 5 years we could not set foot on campus. During this period we organized what the Israeli army called cells of illegal education. We were teaching in apartments, in rented flats, in churches, in mosques, in gardens, in cars, and we kept our infrastructure. Even this attempt to minimize the damage and to keep the university going, they attempted to crush it.
I went to college in the States and I found it very differently. Your biggest worry about in the States is if I'm going to pass my class Or, oh, I hope I have a lot of friends. Over here, it's totally different. You have to worry, oh my God, would I be able to get to school? Is there going to be a checkpoint? Is there going to be a demonstration? Am I going to get shot at? Is there going to be tear gas? So it's like completely different.
Here, it's just like you don't know if you're going to live or you're going to die, you know? You're going to school as if you're going to fight a war. Don't find a tank in the middle of the road on your way to college.
Just the other day, there were 2 tanks in an army jeep, and they're standing there checking your passport and, you know, your student visa and all this stuff. And it's just like, we want to get to school. We want an education. We're humans, and we have a right to our education.
In places like the United States, people cannot understand what's going on because simply the experience is beyond their frame of reference.
I can't study at night because my bedroom light is going to be open and it's across the street from their settlement. They shot at me. I was reading my biology book. I was studying for my midterm, and my mom and dad are like, "No, get out of the room," because they started shooting. I was like, "No, Mom, I want to get an A in the class. Let me study." So I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden you hear something on my bedroom window. I was just like, okay, maybe I should go downstairs. I couldn't study for my test. It's like, I tell my American friends, it's like, do you understand what I'm going through?
The amazing thing is not that you have cases of suicidal students. The amazing thing is the bulk of them, they try to carry on in the middle of this mess as if life is normal, as if they want to celebrate their graduation and they want to build their life and they want to carry on. That's the other part of the coin. The root problem here is occupation. Everything else emanates from there.
The most severe problem is people who need medical care.
We've documented numerous cases where people have died. In fact, I believe that one of the last cases we documented was a woman who was in labor, who was not allowed to get to the hospital, and she and the baby both died.
If people like that, if people who are really sick and really need to go to hospitals cannot do that, so I think you can imagine what happened to regular people that just want to go to work, just want to go to do some shopping, or even just visit friends.
It's like living in a prison, a gigantic prison.
Haaretz, the intellectual newspaper in Israel, ran a whole, like a 4-page magazine article on the refugee issue. It had a picture of Tel Aviv University now and what was there before Tel Aviv University, a Palestinian village. And those refugees are in Gaza.
غزة والله يا عم غزة الثاني شافت الويل ويل عاد نكذب والله غزة احنا معنا لينا بس مش قد غزة مستحيل غزة أكثر.
I think that Gaza is a main problem. There are lots of violations that you will not see in the West Bank, you will see in Gaza. We find it hard to monitor the human rights situation in Gaza because the Israeli army do not let us in.
Palestinians in Gaza had been under Israeli military control for over 38 years, where 1.3 million Palestinians were crowded together to make room for 8,000 Israeli settlers. In August of 2005, Israel dismantled its settlements and military posts inside Gaza and relocated its settlers. The media, along with Israeli politicians, portrayed this as an unprecedented sacrifice. In reality, it was simply a matter of Israel finally complying with international law. Although Israel's presence inside Gaza is no longer visible, Israel will still retain ultimate control over Gaza's borders, coastal waters, and airspace, creating a virtual prison.
Refugee camps, even if there was no conflict with Israel, are just humanly horrible. They're so overcrowded. and you have 14 to 25 people living in a space. There's no place for children to be there. No streets, there are little alleys, no trees, nothing.
تقدر تسكن هنا تقدرش لأنه المواقف صعبة هنا، والواحد إذا وقف قاعد هنا عطول بتلمس، قبل ما يضرب الصاروخ ببقى متلمسين، لأنه كل ما يضرب الصاروخ بتشكك الحيط.
قذيفة من فوق دخلت على الشباك، بعدين كسرت كل الشبابيك والدار انحرقت. ليش هما كسروا غراض، كسروا لعبة، لسه في كتير غراض ساحوا، كله رميناه على الزبالة والأواعي رميناها على الزبالة، ونشحت من دور الناس أواعي للباس، وحتى الأكل اللي بناكل فيه ريحته غاز ومش راضيين نصب أواعينا، وهينا لابسين غاز. لو تشموهم أواعينا خلي اليهود يجوا يشموا أواعينا ويشوفوا دارنا. كل ما نيجي نتحمى في الدار نيجي نعمل نشوف الريحة كلها كتلاتنا كتل. هاي الأواعي شوف ها ما لمنعهم مش غير شم غاز. ايش كده سوي؟ حتى نظارتي اللي أبويا جاب لي إياها ما فرحتش عليها، حتى الإسورة اللي أمي جابتها الحلب الخواتم ما فرحتش عليهم. كيف بدي أفرح عليهم والعبد وهذاك؟ كيف بدي أفرح على أغراضي أنا؟ نفرح على أغراضنا بإيش؟
يعني أطفالنا مش عارفة تعيش ولا إحنا عارفين نعيش، يعني عيشة ايش بدي اقول لك كلها خوف ورعب، عايشين في الخوف والرعب.
انا بروح المدرسة كل يوم بسمع الطخ، انا بخاف من الطخ حتى بصير راجف لما اشوفه.
This is what has been fired on this neighborhood. This is civilian neighborhood. There are no soldiers here. There are no military installations here. This is strictly harassment to get these people to move away from the border so that the Israeli tanks can move at will. They want these people cleansed from this area. It's that simple. And it's a way to get people to be humiliated and destitute again.
In Gaza, you can see also the extent of house demolitions, much more extensive than in the West Bank. Whole neighborhoods have been demolished. Hundreds of people do not have any houses anymore because they are next to settlements or next to the border, which is, of course, a clear violation of humanitarian law.
People have no chance to get their personal items out. They have no chance to call for help. And this is far away from most media outlets. You are amongst the very few journalists who have even seen this. European or American journalists who have even been here because people are afraid to come or it's too hard to come.
And one of the things we were told in Gaza by a very respected Palestinian psychologist who had just completed a study of 1,000 Palestinian children was that they had discovered that many of these Palestinian children no longer had a will to live, that they were so dehumanized and so affected by seeing their fathers particularly beaten by Israeli defense forces, that the psychological condition is one of the dimensions of the conflict that is not widely understood.
Palestinians called for an international observer force that would stop the violence, but this action was blocked by Israel. Finally, a group of Palestinian and Israeli human rights activists together created the International Solidarity Movement, which has brought people from around the world of all ages and backgrounds to provide a nonviolent international presence to try to fill this need. Rachel Corrie, a 23-year-old American student, went to Gaza to join in these efforts, sending back emails to her parents.
I have been in Palestine for 2 weeks and 1 hour now, and I still have very few words to describe what I see. It is most difficult for me to think about what's going on here when I sit down to write back to the United States. Something about the virtual portal into luxury. I don't know if many of the children here have ever existed without tank shell holes in their walls, and the towers of an occupying army surveying them constantly from the near horizons. I think, although I'm not entirely sure, that even the smallest of these children understand that life is not like this everywhere. It was Sunday afternoon in Charlotte, about noon actually, and I received a phone call, and my son-in-law, Kelly, was on the phone, and he asked if Craig was there. And something about the way he asked made me realize, I felt right away that something was wrong. And then I asked, why, Kelly? And he hesitated for a minute, and he said, we've had some very sad news. And then my daughter, Sarah, I could hear her in the background, and she got on the telephone, and she said, Mom, it's Rachel. And I think the first words out of my mouth then were, is she dead?
We were opposing the demolition of farmland and other property, Palestinian property, by Israeli destruction forces and bulldozers. And the bulldozer drove up, and it kept going, and she tried to move back, but she couldn't move back. She got caught underneath. She got caught underneath the bulldozer. Many other internationals began to surround the bulldozer and yell at it and tell it that there is somebody there, and it did not stop.
Where Rachel was killed, she was protecting a doctor's home. And that's important to realize. And the 3 children, his wife, she knew that family, and that doctor felt that Rachel was like a daughter to him. He bought that house. It was in the middle of the neighborhood. There were other rows of houses between his house and the border. Those other homes, those other streets were all destroyed, and now it was his turn. And I've had people say, well, she was in a war zone, and Cindy points out that war zone is people's neighborhoods. Those are children.
I'm here for other children. I'm here because I care. I'm here because children everywhere are suffering, and because 40,000 people die each day from hunger. I'm here because those people are mostly children. We have got to understand that the poor are all around us, and we're ignoring them. We have got to understand that these deaths are preventable. We have got to understand that people in third world countries think and care and smile and cry just like us. We have got to understand that they are us. We are them. My dream is to stop hunger by the year 2000. My dream is to give the poor a chance. My dream is to save the 40,000 people who die each day. My dream can and will come true if we all look into the future and see the light that shines there.
As Israel completed its withdrawal from Gaza, the following day it issued orders to confiscate additional Palestinian land from the West Bank and continue the construction of a separation wall. This wall is twice the height of the Berlin Wall and 4 times longer. It rips through villages, severing travel for work, healthcare, and education, separating farmers from their lands and families from loved ones. An Israeli study revealed that the barriers route was chosen in order to confiscate land intended for illegal settlement expansion, not for security reasons.
Here you have this huge wall being constructed right in the middle of the West Bank. How can anybody believe that there's going to be the creation of a real state? It's a symbol and a reality of oppression.
Anybody outside of Israel who supports a two-state solution has to be very careful, because what they mean in two-state solution is that 90% of historical Palestine would be Israel. In the rest 10% you'll have 2 huge prison camps, one in the Gaza Strip and one in the West Bank. The people who fought in the war were also the people who wrote the history books of the war. And they already had a story that they made up about what had really happened. And that story was integrated in the Israeli educational system. It was integrated in the media and the political discourse.
Some of us who work as Jewish educators have been admitting over the last maybe 10 years that it is propaganda.
Israelis don't understand what's going on. They don't know the occupation.
We began to educate ourselves. And the first thing we did was invite women, Palestinian women, to come into our homes and talk to us and tell us what exactly was the problem as they saw it. And little by little we learned about their lives. We learned about the suffering they encountered on a daily basis. We learned about the killing going on there, about the lives that were completely circumscribed by an occupation that they had no control over.
I'm one of the few Israelis not in uniform and not a settler that's been in the territories in the last 9 months. You see that the army was actually waging a very cruel war.
On the Israeli side, there seems to be no understanding that this is how you create terrorism. If you are so repressive on a people, you give them the sense of having no options, and that's a very dangerous place.
In fact, there's a very clear correlation between the kind of human rights abuses that Israel commits in the West Bank and Gaza and the Palestinian militant response to those abuses.
Most Israelis have very clear views. This is a very political country. And when you talk to somebody, you can argue all night. And you can go red in the face or blue in the face or whatever color, you won't get anywhere. But when somebody says, I refuse to do this, this is wrong for me, for us, for our country, this is immoral, and I'll go to prison rather than do it. And one guy does it, 5 guys, and 50 and 100, and people say, hey, what's going on here? These aren't cowards, these aren't traitors. Most of them are officers, by the way. So if these guys are refusing, there must be something wrong here.
Nobody can argue with what I've seen. I mean, they may not like how I say it, or they may not like all the facts that I convey. It may sound like I'm imbalanced, but the fact is, when you're dealing with oppression, there is no balance.
Even someone with a 20% open mind would reach the same conclusions that our commission reached. You could be pro-Israeli, and still, if you saw these realities, You'd have to have a completely closed mind not to come to the same conclusions that we reached.
So the violence begins with the occupation. The opposition is resistance to the occupation. Resistance to violence is legitimate in any country in the world. I may disagree with some of the acts of resistance. I think some of the tactics are stupid.
Attacks on Israeli civilians are stupid, immoral, and counterproductive. They should be stopped.
We should not use violence whatsoever, because it really destroys our intentions. And it destroys our position, which is in the higher moral standing. We are the victims, and the world should not understand that we are the victims.
Criticizing the Israeli government policy for assassinating people or for shooting children and maiming them, for thousands of children, that's not anti-Semitic, that's humane.
We have to tell the truth about what's going on and say as clearly as we can, if you keep going down this path, you're going to destroy yourselves. No enemy will have to destroy you. You're rotting from within because of the methods you're using against innocent people.
I don't think even with the best video that you can make, Americans will really understand what it is like to be a Palestinian under occupation. I guarantee you, if you spend 1 week in Gaza or in the West Bank, you will understand it in a very profound way.
All the wars of independence, you can start if you want with the war of independence of the United States. They said no taxation without representation. And we demand taxation from the Palestinians and don't give them any representation. It is the same all over the world, and nobody wants to be under somebody's occupation.
As an Israeli, we go to India and to South America to meet the Native American Indians. We're looking for these indigenous people with some kind of more rooted wisdom, and they're right here. They're right here, right under our noses. Nobody ever comes here. The Falahin, for me, the Palestinian Falahin, it's like, everything that that people go looking for. People with deep, deep roots, really connected to the earth, with this romance with their land, and just incredibly wise and open-hearted, and simple, beautiful. And Israelis never see them unless it's through a target. I wish that people knew what was really going on here, and I wish that people could see these people through my eyes. That's what often I'm looking at people and they're so incredibly beautiful, and I'm just thinking, I wish that Israelis could for 1 minute see them through my eyes.
No amount of reading, attendance at conferences, documentary viewing, and word of mouth could have prepared me for the reality of the situation here. You just can't imagine it unless you see it. This is not at all what I asked for when I came into this world. This is not at all what the people here asked for when they came into this world. This is not the world you and Dad wanted me to come into when you decided to have me. This has to stop. I think it is a good idea for us all to drop everything and devote our lives to making this stop.
The real battle for justice in the Middle East has to be fought and won here in America.
This is an American issue, because this is an issue of American foreign policy.
The Israelis are talking about this, and I think it's time for Americans to realize they're the only ones not talking about it. And it's actually very dangerous for their own interests and for the interest of Israeli Jews here.
Well, we're not going to be tossed in jail. We're not going to be tortured. You know, we're not facing what people in the occupied territories are facing. If we decide we don't want to do it, fine. But then try to look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm a murderer.
It's really high time for Americans to step up to the plate, to do whatever we can, encourage our government to take a strong initiative to end the occupation.
Those who really care about the interests of Israel should exert all the pressure possible in order to force Israel to stop the aggression, stop the repression, end the occupation.
And the just solution has to be ending the occupation. Ending the occupation is step number one.
Justice is the best way of bringing about security and peace.
There'll be no security for Israel as long as this kind of oppression continues.
Close my eyes tonight. My conscience by